Thanks for tuning in to the PLR podcast, where we seek to build a network of leftists in the state of Rhode Island so that someday we can win political power. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to our Patreon. There's more content there that is not so Providence or Rhode Island centric. I just posted a part 1 of a 5-part series on German social democracy and the history of that. There's more content coming up. We're going to do a whole series on Gramsci. We have that planned. So there's a lot of content, a lot of potential stuff. And that website is patreon.com/PLR podcast. Today we're joined by a friend of mine, Jon Cho-Polizzi, talk about his PhD work with the German theorist Max Czollek. Did I get that right? Czollek?
You did.
In particular, we're going to talk about 2 works by Czollek, as well as Jon's own translation work. The works are De-Integrate Yourselves and Overcoming the Present. So I thought first, Jon, that you could maybe introduce yourself a little bit and then talk about your work and Max more broadly as a figure.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess you already gave me a nice introduction. My name's Jon Cho-Polizzi. Right now I'm based out of Berkeley, California, but I've spent really a good half of the last decade moving back and forth between the East Bay Area and the German-speaking world. Most recently, I was in Berlin, and I work as a professional translator for quite a few radical contemporary German language writers, as well as some poets and journalists. And I've been working in the last couple years with an intersectional group of young, mostly Berlin-based authors like Max Czollek, the author whose works we're going to be discussing today. I have a PhD in German studies from UC Berkeley, and my research was focusing on the intersection between migration and literature, the way the migration experience shapes the language, as well as the literary representation of the German-speaking world, focusing in a little bit on questions of authorship and resistance. But I've also got a master's in translation studies from a German university. That's the Ruprecht-Karls-Universität Heidelberg. And I've been working for about the last 5-6 years as a professional translator on the side, kind of moving more into freelance work this last year with the pandemic, as all work sort of switched to being remote. I've also contributed to a few of Alex's more recent projects, so it's cool to be a part of this podcast as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you helped with Punks Around, both the POC issue and then and the Christmas Carol, the Xmas Carol. Yeah. So yeah, I'm excited to have you on, and I am really excited to hear more about what you do. And in particular, you had me read these 2 articles by Max Czollek, because the way you described it is that he's very important to you. So can you explain a little bit about who he is and why?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could begin with just a bit of background on the author. And I've kind of prepared some notes about that, and you can just feel free to interject or interrupt me at any time. I wanted to have, like the names and dates and everything down correct so I don't spread any fake news. And then we can just kind of jump into a discussion of the text at any time, or if I say something that you think needs a little bit more explanation, you can just kind of interrupt and ask questions, if that works for you.
Yeah.
So Max Czollek was born in Friedrichshain in East Berlin in 1987, sort of during the dying days of the German Democratic Republic, that's East Germany. He's the grandson of the Holocaust survivor Walter Czollek, who was a publicist, a journalist, and a prominent member of the KPD, which is the German Communist Party. And Walter Czollek escaped from Nazi Germany and led an underground radio station out of Shanghai during World War II. And being sort of devout, idealistic communist, the senior Czollek returned to East Germany after the defeat of Nazi Germany, and his son, Max's father, became an activist and politician in East Berlin. So you could say Max Czollek is sort of born into this tradition of radical activism. And his childhood also saw a lot of really important political events, the collapse of the communist system in East Germany, the sort of raging pogroms of the 1990s against legal immigrants and against Jews, race riots, and sort of spread of neo-Nazi violence, which really belie the public narrative of Germany having a peaceful reunification, particularly in the impoverished regions of former East Germany. And you could also say that his formative years were marked by this sort of stutter step process towards naturalization for the hundreds of thousands of legal guest workers who were living in Germany and their descendants. In many cases, this was second or third generation of German-born so-called guests whose ancestors came from the Mediterranean basin, but outside of the expanding boundaries of the European Union. And I think their struggles for legal recognition and citizenship really influenced Czolleck's understanding of contemporary German society as what a lot of people would refer to as a post-migrant nation, so characterized first and foremost by its radical diversity. And even though Max himself is the descendant of a long line of German-speaking Jews, I think his relationship to Jewish identity in Germany is really defined by the experience of the 1990s, which saw the patriation of tens of thousands of Russian-speaking Jews from the former Soviet Union, and then the sort of rebuilding of Jewish life in Germany for the first time since National Socialism under this new guise with immigrants from what had not previously been the German-speaking world. Do you have a question?
No, I think all that is great. I mean, the biggest takeaway from the two works that I read is the focus on that term integration, or I mean, from his perspective, deintegration. But the way that you just contextualized his life, having lived through the fall and the disappearance of East Germany, and the integration process, I guess, in the 1990s, not only for Jews and Muslims who were coming from the East, whether East Germany or the former Soviet Union, but also for Germans themselves learning how to integrate with one another.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the American context, integration often, maybe not always, but often has sort of a positive connotation. We think about integrating schools and sort of efforts to overcome social or ethnic boundaries. But in the German context, I think especially since the 1990s, integration has also been this process of establishing sort of hegemony for the West German perspective on things. You know, East Germany in some ways integrated into a unified Germany, but in most cases, it really just meant that the West German story, the West German way of life became the norm. And for immigrants, it means that moving to Germany means accepting the dominant German society without necessarily any say in influencing that, and a very marked effort, I think, by cultural institutions in Germany to reject this in many cases. So when I think Max calls for deintegration, he's really trying to reject this sort of top-down understanding of what contemporary Germany is. And when I've spoken to him about this, he often goes back to his childhood and he says, you know, growing up in the 90s, he was part of what was essentially the first cohort of Jewish school children to attend Jewish schools, to be accompanied by Jewish cultural institutions from childhood on since the end of World War II. And he says, you know, on the one hand, this is great because it marks this real reestablishment of a Jewish German identity. At the same time, it normalized the sort of everyday life experience behind weapons checkpoints, metal detectors, barbed wire security fences, and I think emphasized for him what he often calls, using the theory of Karl Mannheim and Karl Löwenstein, militant democracy, this need to really actively engage in defending the democratic process, defending your own position within it as a marginal or a member of a marginalized community. So that's one point. I had thought perhaps that I'd talk a little bit about some of his other work before we focus in on the text that we're talking about, just because pretty much none of his major works are available in English. A lot of his shorter essays or interviews, things like that, are available online in English, but a lot of the bulk of his work is still only available in German. So I thought I could give a little bit of context about that, and then we can focus in on the articles that you read.
Yeah, because he's really well known for his literature, right? poetry and stories.
Yeah,
I think.
exactly. So he's first and foremost a poet. He's published 3 collections of poetry, mostly with the independent publishers Verlagshaus Berlin. This is Druckkammern in 2013, Jubeljahre in 2015, and Grenzwerte in 2019. And he's also contributed to a lot of anthologies of contemporary poetry. I think he's really established a name for himself as this sort of radical political poet. But despite these successes as a poet, I think right now his reputation in Germany really stems from his 2 works of nonfiction and his political activism. He sort of plays this role in mainstream society as a provocateur. He works with a number of theaters. He does sort of multimedia, videos, social media, and is sort of often injecting himself into larger conversations and establishing this sort of ulterior position within that. So alongside his poetry, I think, as you've already mentioned, he has the 2 volumes of nonfiction, Desintegriert euch, De-integrate yourselves, which was published in 2018. That's the work we'll be talking largely about today, I think. And Gegenwartsbewältigung, which is Overcoming the Present, the larger version of which was published in 2020, but a shorter sort of teaser of which was published as an essay the year before. And both of these popular works really challenge this dominant narrative that Germany has successfully navigated its Nazi past. This is a word, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which literally means overcoming the past. And he sort of offers this challenge to it that says, well, we also need to overcome the present. And then I think, yeah, what's up?
But I also sort of got the sense that in like a genuine way, I don't think that he thinks that Germany has overcome its past.
No, I don't think by any means. I think what he often argues is that Germany has sort of staged this understanding of its past as having been successful, as having successfully, navigated the tragedies and the traumas, and that we could sort of start fresh. And what he is interested in doing in his work is going back and looking at these places where that hasn't been the case, particularly in regards to what is outside of mainstream German society, and looking at the ways in which the dominant narrative that Germany is this sort of, liberal democracy with a lot of room for different voices and differing opinions really has carved out a very small space for dissent, a very small space for differing opinions, and tends to only give a platform to minorities who are ready to espouse a position which stabilizes or normalizes the status quo. And I think that that's really at the basis of his position in De-integrate yourselves. And I think it's also something that he really tries to get into in more of his activist type work.
There's like a double hurdle or double issue with the topic of integration. I think that you put it, your background, your explanation of his history and stuff, put it in that, like, not only is the sense of integration and what constitutes integration defined by ethnic Germans, but it's also defined by West German ethnic Germans, you know what I mean? Rather than...
Absolutely.
And so, I mean, what I got out of that, and I might have read too much into it, what I got out of that is, and you can provide a little bit more context about what's going on with Germany right now, about Alternative for Germany and the ministry that was just created. But what I got out of it is that, like, this myth of integration, of creating like a new normal that sort of is excused from its past, is actually giving fodder to the rise of these right movements.
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of what is emerging out of this is this sort of sense of needing to compromise, needing to find a common ground. And what that often results in is giving ground to the far right, or trying to normalize their terminology, make it part of the mainstream political discourse in a way which maybe is intended to neutralize it, but in fact just simply normalizes it and allows them to spread their own agendas within this sort of wider discourse of politics as normal in Germany. Let me think what I can do there. I guess it would be helpful, because so much of his work revolves around this really specifically German context, to maybe give a little bit of background just about the way the German political system works, and particularly about the rise of the far right in recent years. So let me think about this. I think there's actually a lot more commonality in terms of what's happening in Germany today than you might think with what's happened in the last decade or so in the United States. I think a lot of the recent transformations in the German political landscape have been subject to this sort of same larger international swing towards far-right nationalism. And like here, it's been a combination of sort of grassroots movements, big money politics, and also more underground militant right-wing terrorism. And they sort of meet in a similar constellation in Germany that I think as they have here. What we might be able to trace, at least initially, the far right in Germany back to the sort of isolationist anti-EU or maybe anti-Euro tendencies that came at the end of the aughts, the sort of Euroscepticism where they blamed poorer states in Southern and Eastern Europe and inter-European immigration for Germany's own financial woes. But this Euroscepticism is often, I think maybe more often than not, something like a dog whistle for more sinister, more ethno-nationalist ambitions, where you maybe are talking about the Eurozone as this international monetary system, where you're talking about the Euro as this sort of, free trade zone, but really what you're gunning for is the reestablishment of fixed borders, the sort of primacy of the ethnic German within the German state, and reestablishing the sort of old system of pre-World War II Europe with similar ambitions, I think. Yeah, and certainly this is the case for the AfD, the Alternative for Germany Party, which really achieved its initial platform soapboxing against globalization, but very quickly became this anti-immigrant far-right party with very, very clear neo-Nazi tendencies. And maybe I should take just a step back, because I don't know to what extent this is common knowledge outside of the German-speaking world. The Alternative for Germany, that's the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, is a very ascendant far-right populist party founded in Germany in 2013. But already by 2017, they'd won seats in 14 of Germany's 16 state parliaments, and they rose to national level in 2017 to actually be the third largest party in the federal elections. So for a little background on the political system more generally in Germany, Germany has a parliamentary democracy. And that means that unlike in the US, Germans vote for a political party, or essentially its platform, which then determines officials who will see out that party's political agenda. Although the politicians themselves are typically already known, the emphasis is still more on the policy rather than on a particular figurehead. And because there are literally dozens of small parties plus a handful of larger, more established ones, the single party very rarely wins a true parliamentary majority, which means that a number of smaller parties always have to form a coalition to reach a true majority. The largest of these parties then appoints, for example, the prime minister, who would represent the party, and then they would choose representatives from the other coalition parties to comprise the cabinet. And in theory, this should help ensure that the democratic process is healthy, because no party wins absolute power. The overall political agenda of a ruling coalition might have to encompass a pretty broad spectrum of ideologies. Broader coalitions in reality typically only occur on the state level, where you could see, for example, with the city-state of Berlin, it's governed by a coalition comprised of the larger center-left Social Democrats, and then the more left-wing party, the Left, and the Green Party. And this might be sort of a typical constellation for a more left-leaning state. But on a federal level, it's almost always ruled by what they call the Grand Coalition, which is a union between the center-left Social Democrats and the center-right Christian Democrats. That's the party of Angela Merkel. She's actually a rather conservative politician by German standards.
Mm-hmm.
And I think given the growing threat of the far right in Germany, well, at least to some extent, all political parties in Germany have agreed not to form a coalition government with the AfD. So for the short term, this is good because it essentially hobbles their political power despite the recent gains, despite the fact that they are actually the third largest party now.
But you get,
yeah.
It seems to me that, like, even though they're unwilling to form coalitions with the Alternative for Germany, they, as Czolleck says in his articles, that they're willing to, a lot of the politicians are saying, let's meet them halfway, or let's take their demands, like, let's consider them, yada, yada, as like, I mean, it seems to me that the purpose of doing that is to say that it's sort of to maintain that facade of normalcy. You know what I mean? That, like,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Because they're not really 100% disavowing their political platforms. They're trying to woo voters away from them to maintain the hegemony that they've established. So you'll see, you mentioned earlier the establishment of the Department of Homeland, actually not a new department, but they changed the Ministry of the Interior to the Ministry of Homeland to sort of co-opt this far right discourse and say, talking about homeland, Heimat, which traditionally is a very politically charged word in Germany, the word that was used by National Socialists, the word that was used going back into the 19th century by the sort of radical nationalists to always mean an exclusive ethno-state, has now been co-opted as this friendly word. Well, we're just talking about homeland. Homeland is for everyone, right? But it's clearly not, because if you're a person of color in Germany, you're a Jew or a Muslim in Germany, you know that word Heimat does not apply to you. So by co-opting this sort of discourse of the far right and trying to normalize it and say, well, we're using it too in the mainstream parties, maybe they're hoping to win a few fringe voters and hoping that people that are flocking to them because they hold the majority are going to let this slide. And I think that this sets a dangerous precedent long term.
So, like, over integration, like, in quotation marks, is like giving a platform to these right groups.
Yeah, I think so. Or if not just giving them a platform, still taking this position that there is one German mainstream, that there is one German identity to which immigrants, people of color, non-Christians don't necessarily belong. And having this idea that there is an identity into which one must integrate in order to become German really gets rid of the reality of the diversity of the modern German state. Post-World War II, Germany is a very multicultural place, Germany. And to sort of still maintain this notion of integration just really ignores the country that Germany has become, where there would be a sense that there is one German identity.
That makes a lot of sense. Did you have more to add for deintegrate yourself, or do you want to? My comments on overcoming the past are pretty brief. Even though, as a historian, as a trained historian, we talk a lot about the past and the present, and also the future, and where it fits in our scholarship. So, I mean, the argument throughout overcoming the present and deintegrate yourself. Have you ever read Tony Judd's book it's called Post-War?
Yeah, parts of it. I've never read it in full, but I think it's a sort of common thing that's referenced in contemporary German history. So I'm definitely familiar with its arguments, yeah.
It sort of reminded me of that, in that Judd's argument, one of the arguments throughout the book that he really hammers home at the end, is that after World War II, there's almost this systemic ignorance about what happened, that, like, not just West Germany, but even France, and even parts of the East, the Soviet Union included, engaged in this program of kind of ignoring the past, so that like there was this idea that, well, if we just pretended that it never happened, it would just go away eventually, which I think is where another place where Max is coming from, that like, if we've been doing this for so long, now we're kind of going back that way without even realizing it, because we never confronted it when we should have to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that they make a lot of overtures in popular discourse in Germany to talk about how, Germany's like this champion of cultural memory, and, it's come to terms with its Nazi past and tried to overcome it. But for a lot of people, this also means reestablishing a narrative of what Germans are and who Germany is today, which really still maintains a very limited scope of who belongs within Germany. And so you may have this narrative of the good German that acknowledges, the sins of their grandparents' generation. There's really an effort made to ignore continuities, to say, there was this, 0 hour at the end of World War II, and after that, everything was good again. And it ignores the fact that all these judges, all these politicians, all of these, members of police, the military, they just transferred back over. They joined with either the East or West German governments, and there were limited numbers of purges of the sort of high-level Nazi officials, but the low-level Nazi officials just became East or West German officials. Mm-hmm. And their policies may be changed in name, but not necessarily in substance. So you see, I think with his argument about overcoming the present, the real need to recognize the continuities, which are largely glossed over, to the extent where you would have a far-right party in Germany now using their Islamophobia and saying, hey, what we're doing with this is actually in defense of Germany's Jews, because Muslims hate the Jews. And you just sort of see how this glosses over and ignores the fact that, well, a lot of Germans have a very, very complicated past with Jews as well, and a complicated present. And so to simply sort of gloss over it and say everything that happened in the Nazi times is the past, and now our real problem is contemporary immigration, contemporary migrants from the Muslim world, it's really just sort of transferring this whole discourse onto a different ethnic group without looking at the underlying continuities. And I think Max really hammers this home in one of his poems in his most recent book, where he says, he basically calls this the comforting security that next time the mosques will be the first to burn and then the synagogues. And I think this really, this is the point. You can choose a new minority group that you're going to demonize, but the problem is not that you're demonizing this minority group. It's the problem that you are trying to define what the majority group is. Mm-hmm. And who is the particular target of hatred changes, with context. But the fact that this hatred proliferates and is maintained in the mainstream German society is, I think, really the underlying issue that he's trying to look at and say, it doesn't matter if the far right is attacking Muslims today and was attacking Jews in the past. The problem is that they're attacking us at all. And to recognize the commonality of that and the continuity between it gives people in Germany a better sense and a better possibility for defending themselves against this.
There's a great quote in Overcoming the Present that I thought summed the argument up beautifully. It's the 11th building block, because the whole essay is built on these sort of building blocks. He says, I have described how the hope for normality in Germany has limited our strategies for combating right-wing parties and movements. In addition, I have argued that the integration paradigm is not in the position to prevent the rise of the AfD, because it works as a vehicle for Völkisch thought. And then there's that big, long German word, Gegenwartsbewältigung.
Gegenwartsbewältigung.
Yeah. For me, consequently means proposing an alternative model which points beyond this way of thinking and allows for a different perspective on the German present, which by extension, I think what he means there is one that is not so focused on integration.
Yeah.
if you were to combine the two articles.
Yeah, I think that is really the base layer for his argument, and I think the commonality that he shares with this larger group of young writers based out of Berlin is, I think, this recognition that while the specific conflicts between social groups, between religions, between identities exist, there is still a larger threat that encompasses a large part of Germany's society today, which they all share, and that you don't necessarily have to come to terms with all of your differences before you can recognize that you share a common threat. And I think that sort of underscores the concept that they all write about, which is radical diversity, in German, radikale Vielfalt, which is sort of the rallying cry that I see with our generation of German artists, writers, journalists, et cetera, that sort of recognize the common threat that the far right represents, which is based in many ways in this paradigm of integration, this sort of model of thinking that there's only one way to be German. In the same way that I think in America, we have this model that there is only one right way to be American, or only one way to look, which is American. And I think that that's really where this group of writers' thoughts, coming from a very different place, really has a message which carries over to our society here and to the same sort of problems that we're facing today in the United States.
Yeah, that was going to be my last question, even though I know from an academic standpoint, sometimes the question of, can you relate your work to what's going on in the United States today if you work on a country outside of the United States, can be really frustrating, because you sort of do have to take these things on a case-by-case basis. But for listeners who are not German specialists, but who want to pull something away from Max Czollek, I was wondering, I mean, where do you see the connection with his work in today in the United States?
I mean, I think that this goes back again to really identifying the way that mainstream society establishes itself, the way that its discourse about what it means to belong within a culture sort of permeates our ways of thinking, where even we talk about maybe in English, like subconscious racism and things like that, where we're not even necessarily aware that the positions that we defend or the positions that we accept have their basis in notions of white supremacy. And I think that by sort of dissecting contemporary Germany and really looking at the ways in which, because I think for a lot of people on the left in the United States, we do tend to look at Germany as being this model of having successfully overcome this fascist past, successfully become this sort of bastion of liberal democracy today. And, it has made strides, and I don't think that we can ignore that. But at the same time, not allowing it to rest on its laurels and to say, look, we made a few good steps forward, but we left a lot of people behind in the process. And understanding that, coming to terms with the past also means coming to terms with the present is, I think, a lesson that we share, or that we could benefit from learning more about from Germany. So in the United States, I think that we oftentimes tend to think about any conversation around reparation or, acknowledging the sins of the United States history as being something that's just so radical that it doesn't even make its way into a lot of mainstream discussions. And Germany has found a way, at least initially, of making this part of the mainstream narrative. Maybe it hasn't gone far enough, but I think learning from the steps that it has made and looking at contemporary writers who are talking about, the steps that still need to be taken provides at least a framework. There's cultural specificity 100% that we need to acknowledge, but the framework is something which could be shared, and I think which has relevance throughout the post-colonial world.
That's great. So that's the end of my questions. Did you have anything else you wanted to say?
No, not really. I think I've sort of mentioned a lot of the intersectional sort of work that's happening in Germany right now, and I might just sort of end by pointing to that. I think that a lot of the strength of what Czollek and other writers today in Germany are doing is trying to form these broad intersectional groups where I think, recently with the pandemic, it's really come to a head in terms of finding ways for people throughout the German-speaking world to come together online, hosting these sort of online panels where they bring together prominent Germans of color, prominent queer and feminist activists, Muslim Germans, and Jewish Germans together, and try to find common ground and open up a sort of broader discourse where everyone has a room to speak about their individual issues, but there are also commonalities which can be recognized, which transcend, maybe traditional boundaries between these groups. And more recently, they've put together this panel that they call the Days of Judeo-Muslim Hegemony, which is sort of a satirical pushback against this notion that there is a Judeo-Christian tradition in Germany, where they sort of promote public discussion. They try to take people that maybe typically reside more in the ivory tower and bring them down to a level where they can provide a public space for questions and answers and talking about their theories and the ways that each of these individual sort of identity politics might speak to one another. And that's something that I think, is always important in any sort of revolutionary movement, and a place where I see Germany making strides right now.
Yeah, that's great. So it's essentially a group of the people who do not want to integrate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like it sounds
and
great.
Want to defend their individual positions with the understanding that, a radical democracy or a contemporary democracy of any kind needs these dissenting voices in order to be a real democracy.
It seems to me like it's what we all need, which I think is what a lot of the criticism of socialism is. It's sort of like recognizing individualism, but recognizing it from a point of solidarity, of being able to say like, yeah, we're all in this together, but you're different than me, and that's okay. We can still do this together.
Yeah, and those issues don't need to be resolved in order to recognize the commonality that's maybe more important as the first step.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Jon.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you.
Cool.